You're watching Bloomberg Law. I'm Lee Pacquiao. The Department of Justice recently announced a settlement among 49 state attorneys general and a smattering of banks over foreclosure practices. The deal comes after a protracted period of negotiation and suffers from no shortage of critics. Joining me now to discuss is Barry Ritholtz. He's the CEO of Fusion IQ, and he's the founder of the Big Picture blog. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So a couple of days ago, you wrote a scathing column for the Washington Post on just this topic. It really laced into the deal, to be frank. Why?
Well, we've essentially given a pass to banks for committing institutional perjury. The Department of Justice and the AGs have looked the other way when you have turned felony fraud into a business expense. You know, we have travel, we have office furniture, and we have fraud. And especially such a blatant, obvious fraud, it's intolerable, and it absolutely subverts the judicial process when you allow banks to lie to courts, and not just a little lie, but big, broad lies tens of thousands of times over and over and over.
Real quick, just to catch people up who might not be entirely familiar with the deal, let's go back to figure out how this entire drama unfolded. What is robo-signing, and why is it such a big part of the residential real estate space?
Well, normally it isn't. It's not a typical part of the residential real estate space. We had a series of banks that became much more concerned with the quantity of lending rather than the quality. So they ended up giving lots and lots of loans to people they shouldn't. Ultimately, these banks should have gone bankrupt, because that's what happens to lenders who are reckless and irresponsible in their lending. But we bailed out these banks. We saved them. And so instead of the Darwinian process of killing the weak, we kept them around. Same management in place, same bad systems, same essential incompetencies. On the other end of the cycle, once we had all these bad loans come back, where you should have a foreclosure process, instead of following the law and doing it correctly, these banks went out and hired literally burger flippers at $8 and took their files and said, here, stamp as many of these through as possible. Typically, to review a file in order for the court to process it, let's call it an hour. You review who was the original lender, how much was the loan amount, what was the property, who was the borrower, when did they go into delinquency, when did they default, have they been notified, have they been served. There's a whole bunch of paperwork to go through to make sure that, hey, this is a legitimate foreclosure, we need to take the house back. And when you go through that process, you sometimes discover, oops, we don't own this mortgage anymore, we sold it, that's why we're not getting payments. Or this is a transaction that closed, the house is sold, and we just forgot to do that. Instead of going through the process, which involves an affidavit where you fill out a paperwork, you sign it, you swear to it, it's notarized and submitted to the court, that whole process was bypassed just with rubber stamps. Everything that's supposed to be in that document, that's the equivalent of standing in a courtroom, raising your right hand and swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, if the documents that were submitted were just completely fabricated. It was felony fraud, perjury on a mass scale.
Now, we have a settlement. We have an announcement of a settlement. We haven't actually seen all of the terms as of yet.
Kind of funny, isn't it?
What do we know, and what are you expecting to come out in coming weeks and
the
months?
longer this goes without seeing the documents, the funkier it gets. The announced amount is $26 billion, but that's a red herring, because we know about $21 billion of it is for write-downs. Look, the banks were already going to write down $50 to $100 billion.
So it's really only about $5 billion.
About $5 billion. Well, it's $5 billion.
Spread out over how many institutions?
5 or 6 to start, with more signing on. Remember that $21 billion that would have been written down anyway. Now they get a tax write-off, so it's not even $5 billion. It's, however, it's almost a push as far as the banks are concerned, because what would have been a loss just becomes a tax-advantaged settlement. So the accountants managed to get their pound of flesh as well as the lawyers.
What does this settlement mean for the foreclosure process going forward? Is this just a one-time buy for the banks, or does this mean that they get a pass on future foreclosure procedural compliance?
My fear is that we have now made perjury, we've made fraudulent felonies just a business expense. It used to be that people were reluctant to do this because they didn't want to go to jail. It's not a civil issue. You commit perjury to a court, Gray Bar Hotel for a year or more, and it keeps everybody in line. We've closed a few of the foreclosure mills that were fairly involved in this, but we still don't know who. Look, I'm pretty sure it wasn't Jamie Dimon ordering just rubber stamp this. I'm very confident of that. And I know it wasn't the $8 burger flipper saying, let me just rubber stamp this. The process was too methodological. It's too institutionalized. What we don't know is who is the mid-level bank exec who said, the hell with 700 years of property law, just rubber stamp it, get it through. If we happen to evict a few people who aren't delinquent, and there were cases, not only people who were current, there were people without mortgages who were foreclosed upon, a legal impossibility. It's the Ford Pinto approach. Some people burned to death. We'll write a check later.
This is, as you said, a profound departure from 700-year-old law and process. Why do you think the government did this?
Well, the most obvious explanation is the sunk cost fallacy. The big banks that were bailed out, there's another problem with the moral hazard of bailouts is that the government that should be an objective regulator, prosecutor, overseer of the laws, they tend to want to protect that previous decision, even if it's a bad decision. So rather than go out and really slam banks who are engaging in perjury, in felonies, we have so much money, we have hundreds of billions of dollars sunk into this, it's just a few foreclosures. Let's shove it over the rug, we'll worry about it next time. Ultimately, property law is protected by the Department of Justice, by the state attorneys general, and their posture as to whether or not they're going to enforce the law or not. This is a law that they've chosen to ignore. You want to lie to courts, you want to lie to judges, go ahead. We've already have too much money sunk in this. What'll be interesting is to see if the judges, sua sponte, turn around and say, you come into my court and lie on an affidavit, I don't care what the attorney generals are going to do. I'm going to hunt you down and put you in jail myself. Judges are the last landed gentry in America. They have the right and the ability to do that.
Yeah, it sounds in some of your remarks that this could be one of two things happening here. This could be about protecting the legacy of the government bailout of the banks, but it could also be about the health or the solvency, if you will, of the banking industry. Say it's both for now. Which way does it skew more, in your opinion?
Well, they're not independent. They're not, you can have both of them. Clearly, there's the psychology of protecting the bailouts if there were all this sunk money. You look at the people who are running the economic policy for the administration. Larry Summers was one of the people who were there when Glass-Steagall was repealed. He was Treasury Secretary when the Commodity Futures Modernization Act was passed. That pretty much allowed AIG to kill itself, and Lehman and Bear Stearns as well. And then Tim Geithner was head of the New York Fed. So all these bad things happened on his watch looking at these banks. So from that perspective, there's a lot of protect the legacy of the bailout. In terms of the second issue, look, the reason the Fed has kept rates this low, it's having a minimum impact on the economy, but it's allowing the banks to slowly rebuild their balance sheets. And so my worst suspicion, the bigger banks, Bank of America, Citigroup, if they actually had to report their books without the FASB 157 exception that says, fair value, the same model that told you to go buy this junk in the first place, use it to figure out what it's worth. If that wasn't it, if they had a mark to market, it's questionable as to how healthy these banks are. So my best guess is it's probably a little bit of each.
So what happens now? We have this mortgage overhang. How does the housing sector move forward? What do you expect to develop there?
Well, the best cure for the housing sector is to allow the excesses to work their way out. That's typically what happens when you have a wildly overvalued asset. We saw it in the dot-coms. They collapsed. Eventually, it reaches a level where they're attractive. And now today, NASDAQ broke 3,000. Hasn't seen that in God knows how long. You only get that healing through allowing prices to find their natural level and allowing the elapsing of time. Look, we gave anybody who could fog a mirror a home for about 6 years, 7 years. That excess is probably going to take at least that long, if not longer, to wind out. Let's say the market peaked at 06. Based on the Case-Shiller data, prices are still falling. We may not have reached a bottom yet. I know everybody's been tripping over themselves to call a bottom in housing, although they did the same thing last year and the year before, so eventually they'll get it right. But figure by the time we hit a bottom, we're halfway there. As soon as these prices consistently stop falling, you could make a reasonable bet that we're in the fifth inning and things are only going to get better from there. But prices continue to fall. Housing is going to be an ongoing drag on the economy until all the excesses are wrung out, and I don't think we've hit that point yet.
All right, Barry, thanks so much for coming in and talking to us.
My pleasure.
That's Barry Ritholtz, CEO of Fusion IQ. If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed, be sure to check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Lee Pacquiao. Thanks for watching.